All right, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff, wealth, success, and all the anxieties that seem to come with them.
Yeah.
Especially here in the U.S. I mean, this whole topic was kind of sparked by that recent news story, the attack on the CEO of United Healthcare.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It's looking more and more like an assassination attempt. Pretty crazy, huh?
Okay.
The details are still coming out. But what's really got me thinking is the public's reaction to it all.
Yeah, I can see that.
So to really get into this, we've got some incredible commentary from an entrepreneur and social commentator who goes deep on this whole dark side of success. They talk about the eat the rich mentality that seems to be gaining traction and why a lot wealthy people choose to stay under the radar.
Yeah.
So is this attack just a one-off thing? Or is it a sign of something bigger, like a shift in how we view wealth and success as a society? What do you think?
It's a fascinating question. And you know what I find really interesting is how the commentator points out that American society doesn't really celebrate wealth and success the same way it used to. It's almost like there's this automatic reaction to kind of demonize anyone who's made it, assuming they got there by doing something shady or even worse, regardless of their actual story.
Yeah, exactly. And they argue that this resentment can get pretty intense even when something tragic like this attack happens.
Yeah.
They even share this personal example in email they got that's just full of anger and aggression,
Yeah.
basically wishing terrible things upon them. It's full of, well, let's just say colorful language, but the message is clear. Pure hatred.
Wow.
And what's really unsettling is that this person doesn't even know them personally. It's like this blind rage directed at anyone who represents success.
So that brings up this huge question of what's driving this phenomenon.
Right.
Is it just plain jealousy? Or is it something deeper? Could it be a sense of injustice or inequality? Or maybe even fear? And then, of course, there's social media, which just amplifies all these negative emotions and often pushes them to extremes.
Absolutely. And that kind of ties into what the commentator calls the eat the rich mentality. They see a link between this sentiment and the rhetoric coming from certain political circles. This idea that there's hypocrisy among those who push for things like higher taxes on the wealthy while being incredibly wealthy themselves.
I see where they're going with that. But that's where things get complicated.
For sure.
You have to consider whether it's even fair to make these broad generalizations about entire political parties.
Right.
And we also need to look at the actual economics of taxation and wealth distribution. These aren't simple issues with easy answers.
No, they're not. But the commentator's main takeaway is that a lot of wealthy people stay silent, not because they're inherently greedy or uncaring, but because they're actually afraid of being targeted or attacked or basically painted as the bad guys.
That's a really interesting point. This idea of silent wealth is something we should definitely explore.
Yeah.
I mean, does it actually contribute to more division and mistrust in society? Does it prevent us from having open and honest conversations about wealth and its impact? Yeah.
And are there ways to bridge that gap between the wealthy and everyone else?
It's a question worth asking. That actually makes me think about the history of philanthropy.
Right.
Like in the past, it was common for wealthy individuals to openly fund public projects and institutions, almost like a badge of honor.
Right.
But these days, there's a growing trend towards anonymous giving, which makes you wonder if it's partly driven by this fear of backlash. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really insightful connection. It does seem like there's been this shift in how we as a society perceive and react to wealth, especially when it's on display.
Yeah.
This whole idea of silent wealth might be a reflection of that changing dynamic.
It's almost like there's this unspoken rule that if you're wealthy, you're supposed to keep quiet about it,
Yeah.
blend in, and not cause any trouble.
Right.
Is it possible that this fear of being singled out is actually stopping some wealthy individuals from contributing to society in more visible and impactful ways? It's definitely possible. I mean, if the only acceptable way to be wealthy is to be invisible, we miss out on potential mentorship philanthropy that inspires others, and even honest conversations about the challenges and responsibilities that come with wealth.
So how do we as a society move past these assumptions and stereotypes? How do we create a space where success can be celebrated without triggering envy? And wealth can be used for good without fear of judgment or backlash? What are your thoughts?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer. But I think part of it starts with understanding.
Okay.
Understanding the different paths people take to wealth, the complexities of economic systems, and the fact that wealth itself isn't inherently good or bad. It's what we do with it that matters.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
Yeah.
You can't assume you know everything about someone just because they're wealthy. Just like you can't assume someone is virtuous just because they're not. And speaking of judging books by their covers, the commentator actually talks about how this negativity can actually stifle generosity. They argue that a lot of wealthy people might be hesitant to give back or share their knowledge because they're afraid of being accused of showing off or trying to buy their way out of criticism. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really important point. The fear of being judged or misinterpreted can definitely be a barrier to philanthropy and mentorship.
Yeah.
It creates this self-fulfilling prophecy where wealthy individuals fearing these negative perceptions just retreat further into silence, which only reinforces the stereotypes and mistrust.
Exactly. And it seems like this whole eat the rich sentiment that the commentator talks about really plays into that dynamic. It creates this perception that wealth is a finite pie, and anyone who has a large slice must have taken it from someone else.
You've hit on a key element here. It's this idea that wealth is a zero-sum game.
Right. But the reality is much more nuanced than that. Economic systems are complex, and simplistic solutions rarely address the root causes of inequality.
So if the eat the rich approach isn't the answer, what is? How do we address the very real issues of wealth inequality and economic injustice without resorting to divisive language and harmful stereotypes?
I think the first step is recognizing that wealth, like most things in life, exists on a spectrum.
Okay.
There are people who inherited vast fortunes, and there are those who built their wealth from scratch. There are those who use their wealth responsibly and ethically, and there are those who exploit and manipulate others for personal gain.
You're absolutely right. It's about recognizing the individual stories, the nuances, the complexities.
Exactly.
And it's about moving away from this us versus them mentality and recognizing that we're all part of the same interconnected system.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm.
We need to move beyond these simplistic narratives and engage in more nuanced conversations about wealth and its role in society. And maybe, just maybe, if we can start seeing each other as human beings with shared hopes and fears, we can start to bridge some of these divides and create a more equitable and just society for everyone. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to this idea of silent wealth and explore its implications a bit further. I'm curious to hear more about how this phenomenon might be playing out in different sectors of society and what its long-term consequences might be. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question to think about. I mean, if you think about it, silent wealth isn't just about individuals staying quiet. It can kind of play out on a larger scale too, like within certain industries or even geographic regions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you might have communities or social circles where wealth is almost like a taboo subject,
Huh.
maybe because of historical factors, cultural norms, or even a sense of guilt.
Very good point. It's like there's this whole hidden world of wealth that exists alongside the more obvious displays of wealth we see all the time in the media. It makes you wonder how this hidden wealth, this silent majority of affluent individuals, is shaping our society in ways we don't even realize.
Exactly. And the impact isn't always positive.
Right.
When wealth is like shrouded in secrecy, it can breed suspicion and mistrust. It creates this feeling that there are two sets of rules, one for the haves and one for the have-nots.
The commentator actually touches on this idea of being normal amongst the monsters, which is a pretty powerful image. They talk about how they've been in situations where people with old money are totally comfortable showing off their wealth because they're surrounded by others just like them. But for those who've earned their wealth more recently, there's often this feeling of needing to blend in to not draw attention to themselves.
That's really interesting. It speaks to those social dynamics of wealth and how people navigate those spaces. For those who grew up with wealth, it might be seen as a natural part of who they are and their social circles. But for those who achieve wealth later in life, it can be like navigating a whole new world with its own unspoken rules and expectations.
It's like they're trying to find that balance between acknowledging their success and not isolating themselves from people who haven't reached the same level of affluence.
Exactly. And that balancing act can be tough. It takes a lot of self-awareness, empathy, and social intelligence.
It reminds me of something the commentator said about how this eat the rich rhetoric can actually make wealthy individuals feel afraid, even those who genuinely want to give back to their communities. They share a story about someone who made it out of the hood and then went back to help, only to be met with hostility and even danger.
Oh, wow. That's a really sad example of how fear and resentment can poison even the best intentions.
Yeah.
It points to a deep mistrust that can exist between those who've achieved success and those who are still struggling.
It almost feels like a no-win situation. If you're wealthy and you stay silent, you're accused of being out of touch and uncaring. But if you try to give back or do some philanthropy, you're accused of showing off or trying to buy your way out of criticism.
It's a tough spot to be in, and it really highlights the need for more open and honest conversations about wealth and how it fits into society as a whole.
So if saying eat the rich isn't the solution, what is it? How do we move towards a more balanced and constructive conversation about wealth and its impact on our communities?
Well, I think part of the solution lies in education and understanding.
Okay.
We need to educate ourselves and others about how economies actually work, the different ways people become wealthy, and the different ways that wealth can be used for good or for bad.
That makes sense. So instead of just demonizing wealth, we need to understand its nuances, its potential, and its downsides.
Exactly. And we need to understand that wealth itself isn't the problem. The problem is how we as individuals and as a society choose to get it, manage it, and share it.
The commentator talks about how important it is to learn from people who've achieved success, but also how hard it is to find genuine mentors in a world where wealth is often hidden or seen as something to be ashamed of.
Yeah, that's a valid point. If we really want to create a more fair and prosperous society, we need to encourage open dialogue, mentorship, and knowledge sharing between those who've achieved success and those who are still working towards it.
But how do we encourage that kind of dialogue when there's so much fear and mistrust on both sides?
It's a challenge for sure. But I think it starts with individual actions and conversations. It's about being willing to share our own experiences, to really listen to other people's perspectives, and to come to these conversations with empathy and understanding.
You know, it's interesting to think about how this fear and secrecy around wealth might be playing out in different parts of society. For example, in the tech industry, where people often make a lot of money quickly, and at a young age, do you think there's a similar pressure to stay quiet or downplay success?
It's definitely possible. I mean, the tech industry, with its fast growth and unpredictable nature, might create a unique set of pressures and anxieties for those who become wealthy in it.
Yeah.
There might be a fear of being seen as a flash in the pan, a one-hit wonder, or even a target for people who resent their success.
And what about in more traditional industries like finance or real estate, where wealth has usually been associated with older generations and established families? How do you think this silent wealth dynamic plays out there?
In those areas, there might be a different set of rules and expectations. There might be more emphasis on discretion, on keeping a low profile, and on passing wealth down to future generations.
Okay.
There might also be a stronger sense of social responsibility, a tradition of giving back to the community that's been passed down through families.
So it sounds like the experience of silent wealth can be really different depending on the industry, the social circles, and even a person's own background and values.
Absolutely, there's no single answer. It's a complicated issue with a lot of different angles, and it needs to be understood within its specific context.
The commentator makes the argument that this whole eat the rich rhetoric, while often well-intentioned, can actually backfire. They suggest that it creates an atmosphere of fear and division, which makes it harder for wealthy people to feel comfortable giving back or sharing their knowledge.
There's a good point there. When we demonize an entire group of people just because they're wealthy, we create a hostile environment that doesn't encourage open communication and cooperation.
It's like we're creating this self-fulfilling prophecy. We assume the worst about wealthy people, which pushes them further into silence and secrecy, and that just reinforces our negative perceptions.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle that helps no one.
So how do we break out of this cycle?
Yeah.
How can we start having a more nuanced and productive conversation about wealth and its place in society?
Oh, I think it starts with recognizing that wealth, like most things in life, isn't black and white. There are people who inherited a lot of money and people who built their wealth from nothing.
Right.
There are people who use their wealth responsibly and ethically, and there are people who take advantage of others for their own gain.
You're right. It's about seeing the individual stories, the nuances, the complexities,
Awesome.
and it's about moving away from this us versus them mentality and understanding that we're all part of the same system.
That's a great way to put it. We need to move past these simplistic narratives and have more thoughtful conversations about wealth and its role in society.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can start seeing each other as human beings with shared hopes and fears, we can start to bridge some of these divides and build a more fair and just society for everyone. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's circle back to this idea of silent wealth and dig a little deeper. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this might be playing out in different parts of society and what the long-term effects might be. So it really feels like we're wrestling with this big question, right? Like, can we actually have a healthier relationship with wealth, one that encourages both ambition and compassion?
Yeah, for sure.
Can we find that sweet spot where we celebrate success without making others envious and address inequality without resorting to those harmful stereotypes? What do you think?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? I mean, the commentator seems to suggest that a big part of the solution is all about understanding.
Okay.
Understanding the whole picture of wealth,
Right.
the different ways people get there and the challenges and responsibilities that come with it. It's about moving past those simple stories and really digging into the nuances.
That makes me think about how we even talk about wealth and success in our everyday lives.
Right.
Do we just focus on the material stuff?
Hmm.
Or do we also think about the values, the struggles, the contributions that often go hand in hand with it?
Hmm. That's an interesting question to consider, isn't it? Like, what stories are we telling ourselves and each other about what it means to be wealthy?
Yeah.
And how are those stories shaping our perceptions and our actions?
And maybe, just maybe, if we can start seeing each other as individuals with our own unique journeys, with both the highs and the lows, maybe that's how we start to bridge some of these divides.
I think that's a really powerful thought, recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all no matter how much money we have.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this.
Yeah.
The commentator really pushed us to think critically about why so many wealthy people choose to stay silent. They argued that it's not always about being greedy or uncaring, but often about protecting themselves in a world where success can actually be met with hostility instead of celebration. So what are your big takeaways from all of this?
Well, for me, it really highlights the need for empathy and understanding on everyone's part.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions about wealth and success and be open to hearing different perspectives.
Yeah.
We also need to create a space where people feel comfortable sharing their stories, both the good and the bad, without worrying about being judged or attacked.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of wealth and success. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation, and hopefully it's given you some new things to think about. Remember, these are complex issues with no easy answers. The real learning comes from the journey of exploration. So keep asking questions, keep trying to understand, and keep the conversation going.